Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Welcome, everyone. Steve, this is our Valentine's Day episode.
Happy Valentine's Day, Nan.
Happy Valentine's Day. You know, I have to say, Lindsay and I don't really celebrate Valentine's Day because everything is always more expensive on the day. So we usually go out either the day before or the day after because they always say the best meal never happens on Valentine's Day at restaurants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
wasn't it just a made-up holiday that the greeting card companies created?
I think so.
I'm so bitter and cynical.
Yeah, I think you're right. We do give each other a card, but you don't need a day to celebrate, right? You can just do it every day.
We celebrate our love every day.
Yes.
That's right.
Well, we're going to be talking about some famous Hollywood couples who really resonate with us on this holiday. You may remember I've mentioned a theater professor that I had in college by the name of Ron Perrier, who I so admire, who was a wonderful mentor to me. And I was his teaching assistant, and he was just this magnetic teacher who made theater and film studies come to life. And it's where I first learned about the first couple I'm going to talk about, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Of course, I had heard of them, but I didn't know the storied history of them and all the firsts that they created in this industry. I found out that Ron Perrier passed away, and so I felt like it was really timely that in this conversation I can give a little hat tip to him and all that he taught me and all the ways he inspired me.
Oh, I love that. And we're so indebted to our mentors and the people that led the way for us. And I'm sorry. So yes, we honor him today.
Yeah, God rest him. Well, it's really kind of hard to realize the impact of Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks today, because today celebrity is an everyday experience, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, people are trying to be famous on social media, even if they're not.
Exactly. And they think they are.
And, you know, we've grown up in an era of television and instant, well, let me watch this movie, let me watch that movie. So celebrity is something we live with every day. But Mary Pickford was really the first actress who was a celebrity.
Yes.
She was America's sweetheart. There was no one before her. Mary had such an influence on the movie industry, not only as an actress, but as a businesswoman as well. She was a true pioneer. She was born in Canada in 1892 as Gladys Louise Smith. Now, her father died when she was quite young from alcoholism, and she realized at a very young age, and I think this is where this businesswoman comes from, that she needed to take care of her family. So she began in the theater at 7 years old, touring with her family. She ultimately ended up on Broadway after going directly to producer David Belasco's office and insisting that he see her. The story goes that she waited in his office every single day and finally one day just declared out loud, "My life depends on seeing Mr. Belasco." And he was so impressed with her that he let her audition, and she got cast in a small part in Warrens of Virginia. He actually suggested that she change her name, and Mary Pickford was born. Her film career, however, began in 1909 working in silent films for director D.W. Griffith. In 1909, she appeared in 51 films alone.
Wow.
She was able to negotiate more money per day than any other actress, and she became known as the Biograph Girl. In fact, she became so famous that Biograph Studios tried to hide her fame from her, because if she had realized how famous she was, she would have asked for more money.
Of course she would, being the savvy woman that she was.
Exactly. She met her first husband, Owen Moore, filming The Violin Maker of Cremona in 1909, who she would eventually marry in 1911. In 1910, as you remember, when the film industry started, it was in New York, and they needed to film in the winter, so she heads out to California. She does some filming there, but she returns to Broadway in 1912 with David Belasco's production of A Good Little Devil. She realizes, though, that film is really her first love, and so between 1912 and 1919, Mary Pickford is back in California, jumping between a variety of studios, increasing her paychecks each time she works. Statisticians calculated that she was seen globally by 12 million people every day in 1915. She becomes so famous. At the height of her success, she was the richest woman in America. As her fame grows, her first marriage is struggling. It's strained by her husband's alcoholism, and there were stories of domestic violence, and the couple is on again and off again for several years. They remain married when Mary meets Douglas Fairbanks. He had a similar beginning as an actor. He was born in 1883 in Colorado, and he began in the theater at the age of 12 when his family needed money. His passion for acting brought him to New York, and he starred in 1906 to great acclaim in Man of the Hour, which elevated him to star status. He married Annabeth Sully, the daughter of a prominent businessman, in 1907. And he goes to work for Anna's father, but when offered his first film role in 1914, he accepts it, and he moves to Hollywood with the innovative filmmaker D.W. Griffith. So they both have these
Yes.
D.W. Griffith backgrounds.
And funny, similar backgrounds.
After his Hollywood debut, Fairbanks and Mary Pickford meet, and they were immediately attracted to each other. But infidelity or divorce could potentially ruin your career.
Oh, scandalous, yes.
Yes. So they hide their feelings, but they do become involved in a secret romance. In 1917, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and Charlie Chaplin tour the country together, rallying support for World War I by selling Liberty bonds. It was also a terrific excuse for them to get together and continue to agonize over
Right.
their situation. In 1919, Pickford, along with Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith, founded United Artists, allowing them to distribute their own films and eliminate that financial obligation to distributors, which was completely unprecedented.
Oh,
during the
absolutely.
time.
And very innovative at the time because
Very.
it's a chance that artists get a say in what's going on in
Yes.
the movies they make.
Well, it prompted Samuel Goldwyn at the time. It's where this famous quote comes in: "The lunatics have taken over the asylum," because these actors and a director were owning a company. In the meantime, Pickford and Fairbanks continue to be conflicted about their secret relationship. Would her reputation and career be killed if they got married? Well, eventually, Pickford divorces Owen Moore on March 2nd, 1920, after she agrees to pay him $100,000, which is what he wanted.
Wow.
Which was $1.5 million in today's terms. And she and Fairbanks do indeed marry on March 28th, 1920, in what has been described as the marriage of the century. Instead of the public hating her for that, it actually increased their popularity to the point where they were hailed as the king and queen of Hollywood. I mean, Mary Pickford has so many names attached to her.
I know. The girl with the
America's Sweetheart,
curls.
the girl with the
Yeah.
curls, the biograph girl.
Right.
Now she's the king and queen of Hollywood along with Douglas Fairbanks. They're the American version of British royalty.
So maybe she started those stupid monikers that poor actresses got stuck with.
Maybe. At least hers weren't so objectifying as some
Exactly.
of the other
Oomph
ones.
girl.
Yeah. They go to Europe and fans go crazy on their honeymoon. It even goes so far as Douglas Fairbanks buys her a home as a wedding present. And so when they come back to Los Angeles, they move into what the press dubs Pickfair, which
Yes.
is a very famous American version of Buckingham Palace, right? I mean, that's
Oh, totally.
Dinners at Pickfair become huge celebrity events with people like, of course, Charlie Chaplin, often present, George Bernard Shaw, Albert Einstein.
Wow.
Presidents Helen Keller, Noel Coward, F. Scott Fitzgerald. It is the place to be and be seen.
Oh, to be a fly on those walls.
Oh, right. Mary's career has now been built on playing young girls in films like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm and Pollyanna. Fairbanks, in the meantime, was making a name for himself in adventure films, starting with The Mark of Zorro in 1920, and then he goes into this amazing swashbuckling period with The Three Musketeers and Robin Hood and many, many others. Fairbanks and Pickford had a lot of firsts in their careers. In addition to United Artists that I mentioned, in 1927, they were founding members of the Academy. Fairbanks was the first president. They're also the first stars to put their hands and feet in cement at Grauman's Chinese Theater. Of course, Norma Talmadge was actually the very first person to put her feet in cement, but that was a total accident. And it's what inspired
Yes.
Grauman's to do the tradition.
Yeah.
Now we're moving moving into, they've been doing silent films this whole time, and there's rumblings that things are changing in the film industry. Pickford does go on to do a film in 1929 called Coquette, and she actually wins an Academy Award for it.
Right.
But the novelty of that, of audiences hearing her voice, which I'm sorry, wasn't a great voice.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah. The audiences lose interest. They also hate it when in 1928 she cuts off her ringlets into this very sleek bob. It made front page news when she cut her hair.
Well, it's almost like when Veronica Lake cut her hair, you know, for the war effort.
Yes.
Yeah.
She's quoted as saying, "You would have thought I had murdered someone." And perhaps I had, but only to give her successor a chance to live.
Wow.
So that says a lot about where she was at with,
and her psyche
with her
of
career.
everything. Yeah.
And she really couldn't continue to play teenagers anymore. And Fairbanks and Mary Pickford were also just constantly on display. So they're both needing to deal with the changes in the industry from silence to talkies. To boost their careers, in 1929, they make a film together, The Taming of the Shrew. It's a flop, and it sort of begins to reflect what's happening in their marriage. As their film careers both begin to flounder, Fairbanks's restless nature prompts him to go overseas, something that Pickford did not enjoy. Well, he begins a romance.
Oh, Doug.
I know, with Lady Sylvia Ashley, and it becomes very public. And in 1930, he and Pickford separate. They ultimately divorce January 10th, 1936. And as I understand it, their marriage was dissolved through an exchange of telegrams, which is just so...
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
sad.
interesting.
Fairbanks soon marries Lady Sylvia Ashley. In 1939, Fairbanks actually dies of a heart attack at age 56. In 1937, Pickford marries her third husband, Charles Buddy Rogers, whom she had met back in 1927.
That's right.
Doing My Best Girl. They end up adopting 2 children, and she is married to him for the rest of her life. She actually became a recluse, though, in later years. In 1976, she received an honorary Oscar. She wasn't able to attend the ceremony, so the Oscar was delivered to her at Pick Fair, and you can go on YouTube and actually see the Oscar being delivered, and you get to see a glimpse into what Pick Fair
used to be. Oh, gosh, yeah.
Fairbanks' son by his first wife, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., has always claimed that his father and Pickford long regretted their inability to reconcile.
Oh, that's sad.
Let's move on to your first couple.
One of my favorite couples of classic Hollywood has always been Joel McCrae and Frances D.
Oh.
You know, besides being so damn beautiful together, they both had respectable careers, and they seemed like genuinely nice people who weren't flashy and didn't really hang out with the Hollywood social scene. They really seemed to embrace family over fame, which I really appreciated.
Yes, yeah.
Joel McCrae, he made a name for himself as a laconic, dependable leading man. Well, he was born November the 5th, 1905 in South Pasadena, California, but he moved to Hollywood when he was young. He attended Hollywood High School, and while still in high school, he worked as a stunt double, utilizing his skills as a horseman. He was later considered one of the best horse riders in movies. Well, he attended Pomona College, where he graduated in 1928, and while he was in college, he was bitten by the acting bug when he appeared in a few plays there.
Okay.
And when he graduated, he set his sights on Hollywood, like everybody does. But it didn't take Hollywood long to notice this incredibly handsome 6'2.5" tall actor, so MGM signed him up. They put him under contract when he was 23, and he was cast in a major role in The Jazz Age, 1929. The next year, he got his real first leading role in The Silver Horde, 1930. He then moved over to RKO in 1930 also, where he established himself as a handsome and versatile leading man, capable of starring in both dramas and comedies. Well, Frances D, on the other hand, was this quiet, raven-haired beauty who was born November 26, 1909, also in South Pasadena, California, not far from where Joel McCrae grew up.
Okay, that's interesting.
But they never knew each other because her family moved to Chicago when she was really young. She went to the University of Chicago for a couple of years, but one time she and her mother and her sister were back in Los Angeles visiting friends and relatives. Frances got work as a movie extra, and she never went back to Chicago.
Oh.
That was it. She was bitten by the acting bug. She joined the Pasadena Playhouse Theatrical School.
Wow.
She was set to go. Well, While working as an extra, Frances got her big break when French star Maurice Chevalier saw her in the studio commissary. I love stories like this.
I know.
She's walking through the commissary, Maurice Chevalier sees her, and he insists that she be cast as the leading lady in Playboy of Paris, his next movie, 1930, and this leads to more roles, including a lead in Joseph von Sternberg's controversial film An American Tragedy, 1931, which also starred Philip Holmes and Sylvia Sidney. Back to Joel. By now, the tall, rugged Joel, he had established himself as a leading man in movies like Born to Love in 1931 opposite Constance Bennett and Bird of Paradise opposite Dorothy Lamour. And Dee, with her delicate features and her stunning looks, was an up-and-coming leading lady in films like Caught, 1931, opposite Richard Arlen, and King of the Jungle, 1930, with good old Buster Crabbe. Well, many people think that McCrae and Dee met on the set of the RKO film The Silver Cord in 1933, but they actually met earlier that same year. And as Dee explained in an interview with Films of the Golden Age magazine, she says, quote, "It was January, which of course could be very cold in California, and the studio wanted some bathing suit shots of me." Of course they did. They always did the bathing suit thing in the winter for the June magazine layouts. As we were standing on Santa Monica Beach, this magnificent-looking young man ran up and dove into the icy water. Somebody yelled, "That's Joel McCrae. Let's see if he'll pose with us for a picture."
So he was already famous by
He was
that
already
point.
famous. So this was 1933, and Joel McCrae was a really big name. So they brought him over, and he posed with a few stills with me, and he was very, very nice. Well, it was about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and Joel had a little bit of beard stubble on his face, which he apologized for, saying that he hadn't been up long, and after exercising his horses, he'd neglected to shave. So I put 1 and 2 together. The fact that he was a late riser and that he owned horses, he probably polo ponies, plus what I'd learned about him liking to party with the in crowd, I concluded he was not a person with whom I had anything in common. But he had this book he wanted me to read. And he said, "Can I drop it off at your house later?" I said, yes. I gave him my number.
What a line.
So he called and he showed up, and that was that.
Wow. That's great.
I love that meet cute story.
I do. I wonder what the book was.
I know.
That'd be cool.
Nice line, Joel.
Yeah.
Well, soon they were inseparable. When they finally did appear in The Silver Cord together, they didn't actually play a romantic couple. McCrae's love interest was Irene Dunn, and Dee's love interest was Eric Linden. So after a short courtship, they announced their engagement to much fanfare at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan. They quickly married on October 20th, 1933, and moved to the ranch that McCrae had purchased in Thousand Oaks, California. However, the pressures of a new marriage and 2 booming film careers proved pretty challenging for the couple, and they briefly separated.
Really?
Right out the gate. Yeah, but they quickly reconciled. They realized they loved each other. They wanted to work it out. So as newlyweds, their careers began to really, really flourish. McCrae made an impact in films like Gambling Lady, 1934, opposite Barbara Stanwyck, who would become a lifelong friend to both Joel and Frances, and also Barbary Coast, 1935, with Edward G. Robinson and Miriam Hopkins, and These Three, 1936, with Meryl Oberon and Miriam Hopkins, which I know we've talked about on this podcast many times. Dee also scored in her film career, playing the romantic daughter Meg in Little Women, 1933, with Katharine Hepburn, Joan Bennett, and Jean Parker. She also did Finishing School, 1934, with Ginger Rogers, Of Human Bondage with Leslie Howard and Betty Davis, and Becky Sharp, 1935, which starred Miriam Hopkins. They also appeared together in several movies, including One Man's Journey, 1933, Wells Fargo, 1937, and Four Faces West, 1948. McCrae and Dee welcomed sons Jody in 1934 and David in 1935. Their youngest son, Peter, would come along in 1955. McCrae, who considered his profession to be that of a rancher and his acting as a hobby, racked up an impressive Hollywood resume before semi-retiring in the early 60s. He was in Howard Hawks' Come and Get It in 1936 with Frances Farmer, Dead End, 1937 with Humphrey Bogart and Claire Trevor, Cecil B. DeMille's Union Station, 1939 opposite his friend Barbara Stanwyck. He was in Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, 1940 with Lorraine Day, and several films by Preston Sturges, including Sullivan's Travels in 1941 with his least favorite leading lady, Veronica Lake. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that story.
Yeah.
And McCrae ended his career in one of my favorite films of all time with his good buddy Randolph Scott. They played brilliant aging cowboys in Ride the High Country, 1962. If you haven't seen that one, go check it out. Well, meanwhile, Frances D, she's carved out an impressive career of her own. She's in films like William Wyler's The Gay Deception, 1936, and If I Were King, 1938, opposite Ronald Colman and Basil Rathbone. She even screen tested to play Melanie Hamilton in Gone with the Wind in 1939, but reportedly was rejected because producer David O. Selznick feared that her striking beauty would upstage Vivian Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara.
Oh, well, we cannot be doing that.
Dee made a great impression in I Walk with a Zombie, 1943. Well, Frances retired in the mid-1950s when she had her youngest son, Peter, and Joel joined her in full retirement in the early 60s. And they settled on their ranch in Ventura County, and they started amassing a huge amount of land up there. In fact, they became some of the biggest landowners of Ventura County, which is where they accumulated their wealth. They often entertained their Hollywood friends at their sprawling ranch, and frequent visitors included Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor, Spencer Tracy, Alfred Hitchcock, Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, Irene Dunn, and Maurice Chevalier. Despite their long and successful marriage, McCrae actually filed for divorce in 1966, citing cruelty as the reason. But
What the heck is that about?
Isn't that a shocker? America's perfect couple. But, he quickly withdrew the complaint, and they remained, from all indications, very happily married until McCrae died in 1990 on their 57th wedding anniversary. Well, Dee then passed away in 2004 while visiting her son Peter in Connecticut. They left a great deal of land to the Ventura County YMCA, and their home ranch was then converted into a museum and event space, and it's now on the National Register of Historic Places.
Oh, good. So it won't be destroyed like Pickford.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. It's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
So the pop quiz question of the week, and this involves the couple I'm about to talk about next, John McIntyre and Janette Nolan. A lot of people may not realize, but Janette Nolan actually provided the voice of Norman Bates' mother in the movie Psycho. But here's the kicker. Alfred Hitchcock actually hired 3 actors to do the voice. He had them all record it, and then he blended them together to make it sound more creepy and more foreboding. She was one of the actors. Who were the other 2 actors who provided the voice of Norman Bates' mother in Psycho?
We'll be right back with the answer and more of our movie Valentine's couples after this.
Hey, Steve and Ann will be right back, but first, another stop on the Hollywood tour. Sometimes Hollywood is about when the other person backs down. Get this, when the 1946 Marx Brothers comeback film A Night in Casablanca was announced, Warner Brothers tried to bully the movie into changing its name. Yeah, they even threatened legal action. You see, they felt the title was too similar, and presumably too disrespectful, to their movie Casablanca. Well, not surprisingly, Groucho Marx was not going to back down. He reportedly wrote a letter to Warner Brothers. He said it was ridiculous for the studio to try and claim ownership over a town's name. But he didn't stop there. He also pointed out that the Marx Brothers were an act before Warner Brothers Studios even existed. And then he suggested maybe he should take legal action to stop the Warners from using the term brothers in their name. And guess what? It worked. Never underestimate the power of a Marx brother. Now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. Before we get further into our great Valentine's couples, I wanted to give a shout out to our listener of the week. And this week we honor Maureen Whitmore from Columbus, Mississippi. Maureen, thank you for the likes and the comments and all the great support.
Thank you, Maureen. Well, my next Valentine's couple is William Powell and Jean Harlow with a dollop of Carol Lombard, if you don't mind.
Now, that's quite a little menage a trois.
So, William Powell, gosh, I just love him so much.
Me too.
He was actually a student at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, starting in vaudeville, and was a seasoned Broadway actor before working in films. He was not what you would say a typical leading man in terms of his looks. He started in silent films playing villains, but when he made the transition into talkies, because he had been trained on the stage, he had that beautiful baritone voice. And so he really made the transition quite easily into films, first at Paramount, then Warner Brothers, and finally at MGM. He had a first marriage to stage actress Eileen Wilson, Nolan, whom he met when they were both cast in a play called Within the Law, which toured for 2 years. They married in 1915 and had a son, William David Powell, who unfortunately died by suicide in 1968. Powell's second wife was actress Carole Lombard, as I mentioned. 1931 to 1933, they were married. They met on the set of the film Man of the World, released in 31, and they also performed together that same year in Ladies' Man. Now, Lombard and Powell were opposites. Lombard, gosh, I wish I could meet her, because she has a salty little mouth, apparently,
Yes,
which I just
apparently.
love. And there's some bloopers you can actually find of her on set. Well, I don't think her language is all that bad. Whereas Powell was this sophisticate. And he was eventually quoted as saying, I was Mr. Carole Lombard, because she was quite the star. Now, he was no slouch, but after 26 months of marriage, they divorced in 1933. Powell would next become romantically involved with someone he would never ultimately marry, but who I think may have been the love of his life, Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow, she met Powell. She had been married 3 times already.
And she was so young.
In 1927, she was just 16 years old. She married Charles McGrew of Chicago society. They move out to California to get away from Harlow's controlling mother. Jean Harlow goes on a casting call on a dare. It's a wonderful story. I won't go into all the details, but eventually, she ends up working as an extra with Hal Roach Studios. She gets a contract with them. She and McGraw divorce because of her work and what she's doing in films. And Howard Hughes actually becomes a big, important part of her life when he was looking to cast the lead role in his sound reshoot of Hell's Angels. And Harlow is spotted and signed for a 5-year contract, and she becomes a star. The executive at MGM, Paul Byrne, takes an interest in Harlow. He buys out Howard Hughes's contract, and Harlow and Byrne actually marry in 1932. She's 21 years old. This is her second marriage. He's 42. She was told by friends that Byrne would never consummate the marriage. 2 months later, Paul Byrne dies by suicide, a gunshot wound to the head. No one really knows what's happened. The studio wants to save Harlow's reputation, who's quite a valuable commodity at the time. So MGM, they are the first people on the scene of this suicide.
The fixers.
Yeah, the fixers. Harlow never discussed anything more about Paul Byrne after his death. Shortly after this, Harlow has an affair with boxer Max Baer, who was married at the time. No. This messy affair, MGM doesn't want any more bad press. So they say, hey, you got to marry somebody. So they arrange a marriage between Harlow and cinematographer Harold Rawson. That marriage lasts just 8 months. So that's number 3. Now, in the meantime, Powell, who I mentioned had been under contract to Paramount, he's stolen by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers doesn't know what to do with him. Ultimately, MGM was the perfect fit for him, and he begins his series of Thin Man movies, which is with Myrna Loy, of course, in 1934. And it's where he meets Jean Harlow on the set of Reckless in 1935. She is 19 years his junior. They begin dating. David O. Selznick was trying to capitalize on what is now a budding romance between Harlow and Powell. Powell and Harlow also co-star in Libeled Lady in 1936
I
with
love that movie. Oh,
Myrna Loy and Spencer Tracy.
that is such a great movie.
And they are clearly in love. Harlow was anxious to marry Powell. This would be marriage number 4. But I somehow feel in reading about them that this one would have stuck.
Yeah.
Powell, as I mentioned, had already been married to a blonde Hollywood megastar in his marriage to Carole Lombard. He had cold feet, and he did not want to do it, sort of like Lindsay when he first met me. So I think Powell was gun-shy just about marrying again to another huge Hollywood movie star. Powell eventually gives Harlow a gorgeous ring, but he doesn't ask her to marry him. She referred to it famously as the unengagement ring.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's fantastic.
In 1936, there's a sweet story about their relationship after The Thin Man is being filmed, and they have to go to San Francisco for location shooting. So Loy and Powell go up there with Harlow. Harlow wanted to stay with Powell because they're a couple,
yeah, of
right?
course.
Well, the two single stars couldn't travel together in those days. When they arrive at the St. Francis Hotel, the hotel clerk assumes that Loy and Harlow are rooming together. And so she couldn't tell him no, so she ends up staying with Myrna Loy. And she wrote a letter to Powell about the experience in October of 1936. She's quoted as saying, Myrna and I had a grand time being girls together. She's really 1,000 times sweeter than expected. And you got plenty of rest, which I thought was very cool.
Oh, I love that.
But in a rather ominous hint at what was to unfold, she also writes in the letter, her, "I wish I felt better these days, more like my old self, but I guess that will get better in time. I think all I really need is you. I hope you agree." And the letter is signed, "1,000 kisses and 1,000,000 hugs, me."
Oh.
And what she references in this letter of not feeling well was Harlow was already beginning to experience the symptoms of kidney failure. In 1937, she starts filming Saratoga with Clark Gable, their 6th picture together. Just before that, she has a photo shoot with famed photographer George Harrell, and he notices something is wrong in the way that she looks. On the set of Saratoga, Harlow is extremely weak and actually collapses in Walter Pidgeon's arms. She ultimately dies about a week later from kidney disease, uremic poisoning, in 1937 at just 26 years old. Powell is absolutely crushed by her death. They have been together now for 2 years, and there were rumors that just before she died, they were intending to get married. Harlow was buried in a private room of a mausoleum in Glendale, right near our studios here, and purchased, some say at the request of Harlow's mother, purchased by William Powell for around $25,000. Harlow was buried in the gown that she wore in Libeled Lady, with a white gardenia in her hand and a note from William Powell, which read, "Good night, my dearest darling." And there are rumors that for many years, he made sure that fresh flowers were always present at her grave. You can see the photographs of this funeral on the internet, and the photographs of Powell, he is so shaken and crying so hard. He actually experienced a physical and emotional breakdown, and he would never discuss Jean Harlow again. And I found this quote telling about Powell, lest you think, why didn't he marry her? I think he was a really solitary guy. He is quoted as saying, "Cultivate solitude and quiet with a few sincere friends, rather than mob merriment, noise, and thousands of nodding acquaintances."
Oh, a man after my own heart.
Yeah, right. Well, the remaining scenes in Saratoga, 90% of the film had been shot. They use a body double. Lombard and Powell would go on to remain close friends. They starred together famously in My Man Godfrey 3 years later, both actors inviting the other, recommending them for the roles. And unfortunately, on January 16th, 1942, Lombard was killed in a plane crash returning from a war bond tour at just 33 years old. Eventually, Powell does remarry Diana Lewis on January 6, 1940. Some sources say he had only known her for 3 weeks, but they remained married until his death in 1984 at the age of 91. So they were married for 44 years.
I always feel a little sorry for Diana Lewis. Having to live in the shadows of Lombard and Harlow couldn't have been easy.
No.
But yet she endured, and they, from what I understand, had a really wonderful marriage.
I think they did. Powell never spoke of Jean Harlow again. I really think that she was the love of his life.
Oh, I think so too. I really do.
Okay, now that I've brought us all down, can you bring us up?
My couple, at least they're happy. So
Okay, good.
they didn't die young
Or anything like that.
Well, the next couple that I want to talk about, two of my favorite character actors. You may not know their names, but you will know their faces. John McIntyre with 144 screen credits.
Wow.
And Janette Nolan with 205 screen credits.
Wow.
They were two of the most beloved and prolific actors in Hollywood. They conquered radio, stage, film, television, and they also appeared together many times throughout the years. John McIntyre was born June 27th, 1907 in Spokane, Washington, but was raised mostly in Eureka, Montana on his family's ranch.
He looks like he'd be raised on a ranch.
He looks like a rancher. And he learned to ride, he learned to rope. He even won a competition for roping when he was 16 years old. So after high school, he decided to go to Los Angeles and attend USC. There, he was encouraged to pursue work in radio because he had this really rich, deep voice. And he landed his first radio part in 1934 in the serial Tarzan and the Diamond of Asher. Great title. And that's where he met fellow actress Janette Nolan. Well, Janette Nolan was born December 30th, 1911 in Los Angeles. She attended LA City College and began doing plays at the Pasadena Playhouse. While in school, money was tight, so her friends encouraged her to seek work in radio. Well, she ended up getting into radio and eventually landed on that program, Tarzan and the Diamond Asher. She met John McIntyre, and, the rest is history. She also did a radio show during that time called The March of Time, where she met and befriended a very young and upcoming Orson Welles. And mark that, because it comes back into play.
Okay.
It really was love at first sight for John and Janette. On August 26, 1935, they were married. But one thing that bonded them is they both hated Hollywood. They were outdoors people. They loved nature. So they ended up buying a cabin in Montana. It was in a remote part of Montana, no electricity, no running water, nothing.
Very un-Hollywood.
It was very, very rustic. And they made a pact that whenever they weren't working, they would be in Montana. That was their haven.
That sounds like heaven.
Oh, it sounds so great. In 1940, John made his film debut in the movie The Ramparts We Watch, which was a propaganda movie about America's preparedness for war, and he played the announcer. So in 1941, he was cast as the lead in the radio show Crime Doctors, and the role required that the family move to New York City. Well, Janette went along with him, and she eventually got into radio there, starring in the radio show Cavalcade of America. While in New York, they welcomed a daughter, Holly. Holly would dabble in acting later and become a renowned art photographer, and soon along came brother Tim, who would join them later. He was born in Montana. Tim would follow his parents' footsteps and become a successful actor in his own right. 1948 was a big year for the McIntyre household. John received his first real screen credit at the age of 40 in the film...
There's hope for us all, baby.
I love these late bloomers. But it was the film noir Northside 777, starring Jimmy Stewart.
That's quite a debut.
Richard Conte and Helen Walker, our beloved Helen. Meanwhile, Janette made her film debut thanks to her old radio pal, Orson Welles. He cast her in the pivotal role of Lady Macbeth in his version of Macbeth. And it was a very experimental take on the Shakespeare classic. But unfortunately, America was not ready for his take on it.
They weren't.
And it was a huge, colossal box office bomb, critical bomb. It was terrible. But she fared much better that same year when she played the wife of Lorenz Hart in Words and Music, 1948. And it had that star-studded cast with Mickey Rooney, Tom Drake, June Allison, Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, Janet Leigh. John's career really kicked into high gear with an appearance in River Lady, 1948, with Yvonne DiCarlo and Dan Duryea. He was also in Command Decision with Clark Gable and Van Johnson, and Top of the Morning in 1949 with Bing Crosby and Ann Blythe. Meanwhile, in 1950, Janette was cast in the film No Sad Song for Me. This was actress Margaret Sullivan's final screen performance, and it marked the first of many times that Janette and John would appear on screen together. That same year, John was cast as the no-nonsense police detective in John Huston's film noir classic The Asphalt Jungle, one of my favorites, with Sterling Hayden and Gene Hagen, and he appeared as a gambler in the Anthony Mann Western Winchester 73, James Stewart. Now, throughout the 50s, John and Janette stayed busy. Janette played one of the resourceful women who takes on the bad guys in The Secret of Convict Lake, 1951, with Glenn Ford and Gene Tierney. Great movie, by the way. She also appeared in The Happy Time, 1952, with Charles Boyer and Marcia Hunt. And in one of probably her best-known films came in 1953 when she appears in Fritz Lang's The Big Heat with Glenn Ford and Gloria Graham. And she plays the integral role of Bertha Duncan, the crooked cop's wife who inspired Gloria Graham's gangster mall Debbie to say, "We're sisters under the mink," just before she blows her away.
Oh, it's such a great scene.
So great. So great.
And she's really fantastic in that film.
Oh, just perfect.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, John was building up his resume in movies like Westward the Women, 1951, with Robert Taylor, which we just saw.
At the TCM Festival.
Apache, 1954, with Burt Lancaster and Gene Peters. And The Far Country, 1954, with James Stewart and Ruth Roman, where he plays, for once, the bad guy. Now, in 1955, John had one of his best roles of his career in The Phoenix City Story, where he played a lawyer who tries to clean up the corruption of a small Alabama town. Around the mid to late 50s, John and Janette began to appear more in television. In 57, Janette guest starred on Gunsmoke, and she would go on to appear in Gunsmoke 8 different times playing 6 different characters, which I love that. Back in the days when they would just
when you could do that.
Hire the same guest actor again and again and again. And she also appeared in Perry Mason 6 times. And meanwhile, John was cast in the TV cop show Naked City from 1958 to 1959. Now, 1960 was a fantastic year for John. He was cast as the father of Elvis Presley in Flaming Star and also starred with Burt Lancaster, Gene Simmons, and Shirley Jones in the Oscar-winning drama Elmer Gantry. That same year, he performed a role for which he's probably best remembered. In Alfred Hitchcock's iconic thriller Psycho, he played the small-town sheriff who helps Vera Miles find out exactly what happened to her sister, played by Janet Leigh. Janette was also in Psycho, as we mentioned earlier. When it came time to cast the voice of Norman Bates' mother, Hitchcock hired 3 actors to do the voice, and she was one of them. The following year, after appearing in the filmed version of Tennessee Williams' Summer and Smoke with Lawrence Harvey and Geraldine Page, John was asked to join the cast of the Western series Wagon Train, replacing Ward Bond, who had unexpectedly died of a heart attack. He would stay with the series until it concluded in 1965. Now, in 1962, Janette appeared in John Ford's Western classic The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance with James Stewart and John Wayne. In 63, she went back to TV in The Richard Boone Show, where she would receive her first of 4 Emmy nominations. During the rest of the 60s, Janette mostly appeared in television in every show you could ever imagine. Now, John spent most of the 60s also guest starring in TV, but he often popped up with Janette, as he did in episodes of The Fugitive. John got to work not only with Janette, but also their son Tim in that episode. Now, in 68, he joined the cast of The Virginians, again replacing star Charles Bickford, who also died unexpectedly. A few months later, Janette also joined the cast as his wife. Now, in the 70s, Janette continued to work in TV, guest starring in everything: Emergency, Columbo, Streets of San Francisco, The Waltons, you name it. She also appeared in 9 episodes of The Magical World of Disney along with John. And in 74, she was given her own TV series called Dirty Sally. I remember it well. I loved it. It was based on a character that she had introduced on Gunsmoke named Dirty Sally, and she played this hard-drinking, curmudgeon-y old woman along with this young former outlaw played by Dak Rambo, and they traveled together to California's gold country to claim their stake. It was a really good show. It didn't last long, but John ended up guest starring on that also. Well, now, for John in the 70s, it was, again, all about TV, but he did pop up in some couple of cool movies. He's in Rooster Cogburn in 75 with John Wayne and Katharine Hepburn, and he's also in The Rescuers, 1978, where he and Janette provide voices to this animated classic.
Nice.
You know, and they were together again in TV in The Love Boat and Charlie's Angels. I just love seeing them together. Now, Janette kicked off the 80s with this very important role as the mother of Robert De Niro and Robert Duvall in True Confessions, which came out in 81. Janette and John also appeared together as a sweet older couple who turned out to be spies in the espionage thriller Cloak and Dagger, 1984, which featured Henry Thomas from E.T. and Dabney Coleman. And she guest starred on shows like The Golden Girls, where she played Betty White's mother. Well, tragedy struck the couple in 1986 when their son Tim, who had struggled with addiction, died from congestive heart failure at the age of 41. John and Janette were devastated, and they buried him in their beloved Montana.
Oh.
In 89, John made his final screen appearance in the Tom Hanks comedy Turner and Hooch. He passed away on January the 30th, 1991 at St. Luke's Hospital in Pasadena, California, after suffering a stroke. Janette continued to work after his passing, and her final screen appearance was in Robert Redford's movie The Horse Whisperer, 1998, where she played his mother. She passed away on June 5th, 1998 at the age of 86. Indications, John and Janette, they had this really wonderful, happy marriage, loved working together, they loved being in Montana, appeared together in dozens and dozens of movies, and they just had wonderful, impressive careers.
I love that. What a great Hollywood story.
Definitely check them out. 2 of the great character actors of our time.
I think it's time for the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Well, and the question was, in creating the voice of Norman Bates' mother, Hitchcock hired 3 actors to do it. Janette was one of them. Who were the other 2 actors? And the answer is Paul Jasmine and Virginia Gregg.
Wow.
Useless information.
Well, thanks everybody for spending this time with us. Wishing you and yours a happy Valentine's Day. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review anywhere you listen to this podcast. And we would also appreciate it if you would follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And we love hearing from you, so please keep those emails coming. You can email us at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. Associate producer and researcher John Price Ritchie. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. That's a wrap.